And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Ford and John Deere, two icons of American industry, have unexpectedly announced large-scale closures of their U.S. manufacturing facilities. This decision has shaken entire regions where these companies were not just employers, but the very heart of life for thousands of families. The plant closures threaten to ruin many cities whose economies depend on the jobs created by these giants. In this video, we will explain why Ford and John Deere took this step, how Donald Trump reacted, and what lies behind this decision: market realities, political games, or something deeper and more dangerous.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
You will learn how John Deere began restructuring its production chains long before the introduction of tariffs, investing billions in new factories in Brazil, Germany, and India, and why America is gradually losing its status as a world leader in agricultural machinery production. We will examine why Ford is moving its electric vehicle production to Mexico and Vietnam, and what lies behind this move: labor savings, favorable tax breaks, or fear of political instability in Washington.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
But this is not just a story about business decisions and geopolitics. It's a story about people, about farming families, workers, and retirees who are now on the verge of losing everything they've built over decades. How are dealership layoffs and rising prices for equipment and parts affecting the lives of ordinary Americans? Why is trust in the government falling? And why are social media filled with complaints and calls for boycotts? In this video, we open the door to a world where the economy collides with social reality and political ambitions.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year, in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
We will pay particular attention to the reaction of Donald Trump, the man who imposed high tariffs in the hope of reviving American industry. But his policies backfired, and now the former president realizes that even his influence over the largest corporations is limited. We will tell you how companies began to resist, freeze investments, move production abroad, and even use legal mechanisms to combat economic aggression.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
You will see how America's industrial revival has been permanently relocated abroad to Mexico, India, and Brazil, where production conditions are more favorable and stable. You will learn why many analysts believe that the struggle between the government and big business has actually become a war against ordinary Americans, farmers, workers, and the middle class, who are now trying to survive in a changed world.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
If you want to understand what is happening to the key symbols of the American economy and why even the most powerful companies cannot withstand global economic and political challenges, this video is for you. We will analyze everything from the reasons for the closure of factories to the social and economic consequences for the entire country. Don't miss the story that is already changing the future of America and the world.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
In recent months, the world has witnessed a shocking and disturbing event. Two giants of American industry, Ford and John Deere, have announced large-scale closures of their manufacturing facilities in the United States. For many, this came as a shock, as these companies not only shaped the economies of individual regions, but were also symbols of American industrial power. The plant closures have caused a wave of anxiety and outrage among local residents and politicians, and of course have not gone unnoticed by Donald Trump, whose reaction to the events vividly reflects the depth of the crisis.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Ford, one of the country's oldest car companies, has been increasingly moving production of its models, especially electric vehicles, to Mexico and Vietnam in recent years. This move was seen by many as a betrayal of national interests. Meanwhile, John Deere, a leading manufacturer of agricultural equipment, began a systematic global reorganization long before Trump introduced high tariffs. The company invested billions of dollars in new factories in Brazil, Germany, and India, gradually reducing production in the US. This was part of a large-scale strategy aimed at reducing the risks associated with political instability in Washington and increased uncertainty in the global market. Trump's reaction was extremely emotional. He perceived the departure of large corporations from the US not simply as an economic mistake, but as a personal insult. His strategy of imposing high tariffs on imported goods seemed aimed at bringing manufacturing back home and reviving American cities mired in unemployment and economic decline. However, the result was the exact opposite. Instead of stimulating growth and development, the tariffs only accelerated the flight of companies abroad, strengthening their desire to minimize costs and ensure competitiveness in the global market.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
John Deere, for example, began construction of a new tractor and combine harvester factory in the Indian city of Pune. This investment is estimated at several $billion and includes not only production facilities, but also a research and a development center that will develop equipment adapted to local conditions. This strategy has allowed the company not only to expand its presence in growing markets, but also to minimize the impact of unstable politics in the US and Europe. Analysts note that such steps were planned long before Trump introduced tariffs, and it is precisely these steps that have enabled John Deere to effectively cope with the crisis without panic or sharp fluctuations. Ford, meanwhile, is actively moving its assembly lines for its electric vehicles to the Mexican state of Guanajuato, where construction of a new factory has already been completed. This plant is equipped with the latest technology and enjoys favorable tax breaks, as well as a cheaper and more skilled workforce. At the same time, the company has suspended plans to expand production in Michigan and Ohio, which has been a serious blow to local communities where the economy was directly dependent on Ford's operations. Despite this situation, Ford has not criticized Trump's tariffs in its public statements, but preferring to talk about the need to optimize costs and adapt to changing market conditions. Trump, in turn, calls the departure of companies from the U.S. treason and a blow to the heart of America. However, as internal documents and analytical reports show, the administration's policies have much less influence on corporate business decisions than is commonly believed. Market calculations, the search for favorable production conditions, and strategic planning are proving to be more important than any political ambitions. In particular, the legal departments of Ford and John Deere had prepared scenarios in advance in case high tariffs were introduced and other countries took retaliatory measures. This suggests that the companies were aware of such risks from the outset and took steps to minimize the consequences. In Iowa, one of the key states for agricultural production, the reaction to what was happening was mixed. During rallies and speeches, Trump claimed that tariffs would bring back jobs and make America great again. However, farmers and workers who were already facing the consequences of factory closures and rising equipment prices began to express their disappointment. Local businesses counted their losses, and the illusion of a revival of American industry quickly crumbled under the weight of reality. In the end, the first and second points of the plan, the closure of Ford and John Deere plants in the US and Trump's reaction, as well as the global strategies of companies to relocate production and adapt to global challenges, form the basis for understanding the current industrial crisis in America. These events show that despite the government's efforts, globalization and market processes dictate their own rules, and even the largest American corporations are forced to look for new ways to survive outside their home country. It is these processes that are shaping a new economic reality in which traditional symbols of American industry find themselves at a crossroads between national interests and global challenges.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Donald Trump's reaction to these events was stormy and emotional. He publicly condemned Ford and John Deere's departure from the US, calling it a stab in the back to American workers and patriots. His strategy of imposing high tariffs on imports, which was supposed to encourage the return of manufacturing to the US and protect the domestic market, met with unexpected resistance, even from major American corporations. Trump had hoped that his tough measures would force companies to stay in the country, support employment, and revive industrial cities. Instead, companies had to adapt to economic realities and move production to places where conditions were more favorable. In many of his speeches, Trump expressed disappointment and personal outrage that large companies were not showing loyalty and supporting his political initiatives. There were rumors within the administration that the president was even considering imposing even tougher restrictions and sanctions on corporations, but experience has shown that such steps could lead to even more serious economic consequences, including job losses and higher prices for consumers. At the regional level, the consequences were no less dramatic. For example, Iowa, a major agricultural state and an important electoral state for Trump, found itself in a difficult situation. During his speech at one of the rallies, residents expressed mixed feelings, ranging from support to open discontent. Farmers and workers, many of whom depended directly on John Deere's operations, began to realize that the promised industrial revival might be nothing more than an illusion. Economic instability forced local residents to rethink their plans for the future, and many entrepreneurs began to calculate their potential losses. Thus, the first and second points of the plan, the closure of Ford and John Deere plants in the US and Trump's reaction, as well as the strategic actions of companies to relocate production and adapt to global challenges, are fundamental to understanding the current changes in American industry. These processes demonstrate that, despite political ambitions and protective measures, market forces and globalization dictate new rules of the game, forcing even the largest players to seek optimal ways to survive and develop beyond their historical base. This shift has far-reaching consequences, not only for the economy but also for the social structure of many regions, as well as for the future of the American middle class, which has been the mainstay of the country's former industrial power. The consequences of the closure of Ford and John Deere plants in the US have taken on not only economic but also profound social and political dimensions that are being felt across the country. Pensioners, farmers, and middle-class workers have been caught in the eye of the storm, experiencing the devastating impact of job losses and declining living standards. In cities and small towns where these corporations, factories, and dealerships have operated for decades, the economy is beginning to collapse. Pensioners are seeing their savings and dividends dwindle, while municipalities are facing budget deficits due to falling tax revenues. In places like Toledo, Indiana, and several cities in the Rust Belt, unemployment has risen and hopes for a revival of American industry are fading. For farming families, for whom John Deere equipment has been an integral part of everyday life, a 25% increase in the price of combines and spare parts has been a blow to the budget. Many are canceling planned purchases, and dealerships are reporting lower attendance and fewer new orders. Car service workers and mechanics, deprived of a stable income, are starting to look for work outside the industry in warehouses, logistics, finance, and even real estate. Social media platforms such as TikTok and Facebook are filled with videos and complaints reflecting growing discontent among the population and calls for boycotts. Trust in the government is falling, and ordinary Americans are increasingly asking who will protect their interests and how they will survive this transformation. The financial markets have not remained indifferent to the situation. Ford's shares fell 27% in just 48 hours after the announcement of job cuts and plant closures, resulting in billions of dollars in losses. For rural areas, this was a death knell, as Ford had long been not only a major employer, but also a pillar of the pension system. Municipalities and pension funds found themselves in a critical situation, which caused additional social unrest and discontent. In these conditions, investors began to perceive the shares of companies related to industry as high risk, which led to an outflow of capital and a decline in market capitalization. The actions of John Deere on Wall Street were particularly significant. After the introduction of 200% tariffs on imports of agricultural equipment, investors began to sell off the company's shares en masse. In 5 days, Deere's market capitalization fell by $36 billion, one of the biggest financial shocks for the company in decades. The market perceived John Deere as a symbol of political instability and economic danger, forcing management to take urgent measures to mitigate the consequences and attempt to regain shareholder confidence. Soon, reports emerged of plans to restructure the business and seek new investment partners, including foreign funds. At the same time, the management of both companies began to actively counteract the economic aggression coming from Washington. Executives began to study constitutional mechanisms to protect corporate interests and redirect their donations to political campaigns aimed at softening tariff policy. Investments in expanding production in the US were frozen and hiring new employees was suspended. The strategic transfer of production facilities abroad was approved and is being implemented at a rapid pace, despite increased criticism from politicians and the public. These actions have become a challenge to the government and an attempt to remain competitive amid growing pressure. Politically, the situation has taken on the characteristics of a crisis of confidence. Many Americans feel betrayed by their own government, which they believe is incapable of protecting the interests of ordinary people and businesses. Changes in relations between the US, Mexico, and China, as well as changes in global trade routes, are already underway, and the much-talked-about industrial revival of America is shifting to other countries where production conditions are more favorable and stable. Countries such as Mexico, India, and Brazil are already attracting the attention of large corporations thanks to lower costs, access to labor, and generous tax breaks. Ford is completing the construction of a new electric vehicle production line in Guanajuato, New Mexico, a multi-billion-dollar project that will significantly expand its manufacturing capabilities. John Deere is expanding its sales and production channels, including regions from Pune in India to Brazil's agricultural centers, gradually bypassing the U.S. Investment in US industry has more than halved over the past 5 years, confirming the trend toward global reorientation of production and capital. The logic of survival for corporate America today is based on harsh economic realities. Production chains abroad provide faster and cheaper solutions, labor is cheaper, and tax incentives are more attractive than in the US. The introduction of a 200% tariff on imports of John Deere agricultural equipment only confirmed the correctness of the choice made by companies that bet on foreign production. This is not just a strategic move, it is a matter of survival in the face of global competition and political instability. Ford and John Deere are not just adapting, they are evolving, moving production and investment outside the US. Even if these decisions are met with criticism and negativity in American society, investment cuts and plant closures in the country are announced only to shareholders, with the general public learning about the scale of the changes after the fact. Companies are well aware of how these steps will be perceived by American workers, farmers, and consumers, but they are forced to act in an environment where stability and profitability are more important than national slogans. Meanwhile, India and Mexico are becoming new industrial centers, offering favorable conditions for investment and production. America, in turn, is turning into an arena of cultural and economic wars, where uncertainty and internal contradictions are hindering development. The return on investment abroad is significantly higher today, making this trend irreversible. However, this economic and political struggle is not between Trump and corporations, but a real war against the American people. Farmers, workers, and the middle class, long the backbone of the country, are losing their jobs, opportunities, and hope for a bright future. Small towns that were built around Ford and John Deere factories are beginning to crumble, and the idea of a strong and prosperous middle class is becoming increasingly elusive. The breakdown of the alliance between the government, business, and American families poses a serious challenge for the entire country. If this situation does not change, the story of a strong middle class and industrial revival may become nothing more than a memory. In this context, understanding what is happening and finding solutions becomes a matter not only of economics, but also of social justice and the future of the entire nation.